In a quiet restaurant, a waiter mocks Clint Eastwood's faith. But when Clint responds calmly, everyone is left in shock. What happens next will surprise you. The golden chandeliers cast a warm light over the patrons, while soft jazz and the gentle clinking of wine glasses filled the air. It was the perfect setting for a peaceful evening, where the city's elite gathered to unwind after a long day. At one of the prime tables near the window, Clint Eastwood sat with a few close friends. His posture was unshaken, every movement deliberate and calm. He wasn't the type to draw attention to himself, yet there was an undeniable air of quiet confidence that surrounded him. Dressed simply but elegantly, he was the picture of composure, his deep-set eyes scanning the room as he enjoyed his meal. No need for flashy gestures, his presence spoke volumes without a single word. For Clint, this dinner was not about the spotlight, but the peace of a well-deserved break. Unbeknownst to him, tonight would take a turn. Fate had a way of bringing the unanticipated to the table. Ethan, a young waiter, approached Clint's table with an air of confidence. His uniform was crisp, but his tired eyes and forced smile gave away the weariness of years spent in the service industry. He was accustomed to the finer side of New York dining but carried with him a certain arrogance that came from knowing he could push the boundaries of polite conversation without facing consequences. "Good evening, gentlemen," he said smoothly, his voice dripping with fake politeness. His eyes briefly swept over Clint's table, landing on Clint himself. The glint of a gold cross necklace caught his attention, and a mischievous grin spread across his face. "Nice necklace," Ethan remarked, his smirk widening. "You don't see many of those around here anymore. Is that a fashion statement, or do you believe in fairy tales too?" Clint raised an eyebrow, his gaze unwavering as Ethan continued, his voice growing bolder with each word. "Virgin births, walking on water, rising from the dead," Ethan chuckled lightly, shaking his head. "I mean, really? Who buys into that stuff anymore?" The mocking tone in Ethan's voice rang out, and the room, which had been filled with soft laughter and polite conversation, seemed to fall silent around them. The air grew heavier, charged with an unspoken tension as Clint's friends exchanged uneasy glances. But Clint, with his unshakable calm, remained focused on his meal, unflinching, yet fully aware of the provocation. Ethan, sensing the lack of immediate reaction, leaned in slightly, eager to see if he could get under Clint's skin. He reveled in the idea of challenging the beliefs of someone like Clint, who exuded authority and wisdom without saying a word. As Ethan's mocking words hung in the air, Clint Eastwood's expression remained unchanged. He did not flinch, nor did his calm demeanor break. His friends at the table exchanged glances, sensing the growing tension, but Clint remained a pillar of composure. He took a slow sip from his glass, the cool liquid flowing smoothly as he processed the words directed at him. For a moment, the only sound in the room was the soft clink of silverware and the distant hum of conversation. The quiet was palpable, the calm before the storm. Clint's silence was not an invitation for further taunting, it was a moment of reflection, a deliberate pause that allowed Ethan's words to linger and settle. Finally, Clint spoke, his voice deep and steady, carrying the weight of years of experience and quiet strength. "You can mock all you want," he said, his tone unwavering. "But the truth doesn't need defending. It speaks for itself." The simplicity of his response cut through the air like a blade, and in that instant, the restaurant seemed to hold its breath. Nearby guests, who had been absorbed in their own conversations, turned their attention toward the table. Ethan, who had been so sure of himself moments before, now found himself staring at Clint, caught off guard by the quiet authority in his words. Clint's gaze was unflinching, his calmness not an indication of indifference, but of a deeper understanding. His words had not been a challenge, they were a statement, an undeniable truth. Ethan's smirk faltered. The arrogance that had once been so apparent began to crumble as the weight of Clint's words sank in. His usual confidence, once an armor, was now shattered, leaving him fumbling for a response. But Clint had already made his point. The room remained silent, the energy shifting from tension to quiet reverence, as Ethan struggled to regain his footing. The atmosphere in the restaurant had shifted. What had once been a buzzing, lively room filled with the soft hum of polite conversation now felt heavy with quiet anticipation. Guests at nearby tables, who had been absorbed in their own meals and discussions, had started to listen. The sharpness of Clint Eastwood's words had broken through the background noise, and now the whole restaurant seemed to hold its breath. Some diners, who had initially been unaware of the exchange, now turned their heads, catching glimpses of the table where Clint and Ethan were locked in their silent battle. The weight of Clint's response settled over them, and many found themselves reflecting on the power of his simple statement. A few patrons nodded subtly, their eyes flicking back to Clint, acknowledging the truth in his words. Others exchanged silent looks, a kind of mutual understanding passing between them. There was no need for grand speeches or dramatic confrontations. Clint's calm response had carried more authority than any rant could have. It was as if the entire room recognized that Clint had just done what most could not. He had silenced the arrogant, confronted the mockery, and stood firm in his belief without resorting to anger. Ethan, on the other hand, could feel his confidence crumbling. The room had grown quiet, but it wasn't the silence of respect, it was the kind of silence that comes when a person realizes they've made a serious misstep. The waiter's smirk had disappeared, replaced by an uncomfortable shift in his stance. He no longer had the energy to keep the same mocking tone. His usual bravado had evaporated, leaving him standing in the center of the restaurant, feeling smaller with every passing second. For a brief moment, he considered firing back, but the words stuck in his throat. What could he say now? His previous insults had been met with calm wisdom, and no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't summon the same snarky response. Ethan's face flushed with embarrassment. The mockery he had once used so confidently now seemed foolish. He glanced at the surrounding tables, only to see more patrons looking back at him, their gazes no longer filled with curiosity but with quiet judgment. It was then that Ethan realized that, in trying to tear down someone else, he had made himself the target of the room's collective attention, and it wasn't the kind of attention he wanted. With a heavy sigh, Ethan quickly shifted his weight, mumbling about fetching drinks for the table, but it was clear that his heart wasn't in the task. He made his way back to the bar, avoiding eye contact with anyone. His steps were uncertain, his head down, as though he had just lost a battle he had been so sure of winning. As Clint's table returned to their meal, the atmosphere remained charged with a new energy. The power of Clint Eastwood's calm response had not only silenced the waiter but also left the entire restaurant to ponder the strength of truth in the face of mockery. The guests slowly went back to their conversations, but the echo of Clint's words would linger long after the evening was over. Clint Eastwood, unaffected by the silence that lingered in the restaurant, simply returned to his meal as if nothing had transpired. He didn't seek applause or recognition. There was no dramatic flourish, no grand speeches, and no need to address the stillness in the room. His response had been measured and dignified, and that was enough. In his world, strength wasn't something to be flaunted, it was something that remained constant, steady, and quiet. Clint didn't need to raise his voice to be heard, his calm composure spoke louder than anything else could. As he cut into his meal with deliberate movements, Clint's presence exuded a quiet authority. His friends exchanged glances, some still processing the brief but powerful exchange, but Clint didn't acknowledge it. He simply continued his dinner, every action a reminder that he had nothing to prove. There was no need for further confrontation, he had made his point, and now it was time to move on. The atmosphere in the restaurant slowly began to shift. What had initially been a tense, uncomfortable moment of conflict had transformed into something else entirely. It was as though the entire room collectively held its breath and then released it, realizing that the exchange was over. The power dynamic had shifted, not through loud words or confrontational gestures, but through Clint's unshakable composure. The nearby diners, who had been on edge during the encounter, now returned to their conversations, though the energy in the room had changed. There was a quiet respect that had replaced the earlier tension. People, once unsure of how to react, now found themselves in awe of Clint's ability to stand his ground without a single raised voice. It wasn't just his words that had made an impact, it was his presence, his quiet dignity, and his refusal to engage in the pettiness of the moment. As the evening wore on, the restaurant seemed to breathe a little easier. Guests who had witnessed the exchange quietly discussed it among themselves, some nodding in agreement with the calm authority Clint had demonstrated. A few even glanced toward Clint's table, perhaps wondering how they might learn from his composed response. No one needed to say anything, Clint's actions had already set the tone for the evening. The tension that had once gripped the restaurant had faded, leaving behind a sense of calm respect. Clint had proven that true strength wasn't about asserting dominance or winning an argument, it was about maintaining dignity and grace in the face of provocation. His victory was quiet, subtle, and lasting, and it had left a profound mark on everyone in the room. As the night wore on, Ethan, the young waiter, found himself unable to shake off the exchange. His mind, which had once been so sure of its atheistic convictions, now seemed clouded with doubt. He had spent years mocking the beliefs of others, confident that his logic and scientific reasoning were enough to dismiss anything that couldn't be proven in a lab. Yet, Clint Eastwood's calm, unwavering response had shaken him in a way he hadn't expected. It wasn't the words themselves that had unsettled him, but the quiet power behind them, the dignity and authority with which Clint had handled the situation. Ethan had entered the confrontation expecting to win, to make Clint squirm under the weight of his mockery. Instead, he was left speechless, his arrogance disarmed by Clint's unshakable composure. The waiter couldn't stop replaying the moment in his head, the silence that had followed Clint's words, the way the entire restaurant had felt a shift in the atmosphere. He realized that his mocking had not only been disrespectful but also misplaced. He had ridiculed something that countless people believed in for centuries, something that had shaped civilizations, brought hope, and inspired millions. Mocking faith was easy when it didn't directly challenge you, but Clint had made him face it in a way that was impossible to ignore. For the first time in years, Ethan felt something unfamiliar stir within him, a sense of doubt. He wasn't sure about the answers, but he knew that there was something deeper in Clint's words that couldn't be dismissed so easily. Perhaps the answers weren't as clear as he had once believed. He stood by the bar, staring at the empty space before him, his hands gripping the counter as his mind raced. Could there be more to life than the science he had relied on? Were there truths beyond what could be measured and quantified? Meanwhile, Clint remained completely unbothered. He continued his evening, enjoying his meal with friends, the weight of the moment not resting on his shoulders. He wasn't concerned with changing anyone's mind. His response had been simple, yet profound: truth doesn't need to be loud or brash to leave an impact. It simply needs to be present. Clint's quiet victory had made its mark. It wasn't about winning an argument or proving a point. It was about showing that the truth, when spoken with dignity and respect, doesn't need to compete for attention. It speaks for itself, resonating with those who are ready to listen. Clint's composed presence had done what any argument or fiery response couldn't, it had left a lasting impression on Ethan and anyone else who had witnessed the exchange. As the night came to a close, Clint left the restaurant with the same calm, steady confidence he had arrived with. He had not engaged in a heated debate or been ruffled by mockery. Instead, he had simply been himself, an unwavering presence of truth in a world full of noise. And that, in the end, was all that mattered.